Kevin, we have your DNA. It was on the lamp in that motel room. So I'm going to ask you one more time, what happened to Rebecca Hartwell on the night of October 15th, 1996?
She wasn't supposed to fight back.
Western Washington. Autumn 1996. A pharmaceutical sales representative checks into a roadside motel for one ordinary night. By morning, she's gone, her room ransacked, her life taken in an act that would haunt investigators for over a decade. 3 men are questioned, all denied involvement, all walked free. For 12 years, the case sat cold while the person responsible lived in plain sight, moving from town to town, crime to crime, until a breakthrough in DNA technology finally gave investigators the weapon they needed to bring him to justice. But here's what will stay with you. The answer was always there, locked in evidence they already had. They just couldn't see it yet. The science hadn't caught up to the crime. The database hadn't expanded far enough. The connection remained invisible, waiting in a laboratory freezer for technology to evolve. This is the story of how a single strand of DNA waited over a decade to speak, how 3 innocent men lived under suspicion, how one family's 12-year wait for closure changed the way cold cases are solved in America, and how the advancement of forensic science transformed from a theoretical possibility into the key that unlocked a mystery that had stumped an entire generation of investigators. Welcome to Cold Case Crimson. Before we continue, hit that subscribe button and drop a like on this video. Your support keeps these forgotten stories alive and ensures that justice, even when delayed, is never denied. We're building a community dedicated to remembering those who can't speak for themselves, and every subscription, every like, every comment helps us reach more people who believe that truth matters, that victims deserve to be remembered, and that even the coldest cases deserve another look. What makes Rebecca Hartwell's case so profoundly frustrating is that her attacker wasn't some criminal mastermind who left no trace, who planned every detail with precision, who vanished like smoke into the night. He was a drifter with a criminal record stretching back years, a man who had been at that exact motel just days before the incident occurred, who knew the layout, who knew the routines, who knew which rooms would be occupied and which would be empty. His DNA was at the scene, his pattern was clear, his history was documented. Yet for 12 years, investigators pursued the wrong leads, while Kevin Walsh walked free, taking odd jobs, committing petty crimes, moving from state to state, building a trail of offenses that could have been stopped if the technology had existed just a few years earlier, if the databases had been connected, if the science had been ready. But while the official search stalled, while leads dried up, while the case file gathered dust in a storage room, Rebecca's family refused to let her memory fade into a statistic, into another unsolved case, into a file that gets mentioned once a year on the anniversary and then forgotten again. Her parents, Linda and Michael, her younger sister Sarah, they attended every court hearing they could find, studying how other cases were solved, hoping to learn new investigative techniques that might apply to their daughter's situation. They funded DNA preservation efforts at the state level, lobbying legislators to allocate more resources to forensic laboratories. They kept her case alive in local media every single year, giving interviews, holding vigils, ensuring that Rebecca Hartwell's name remained in the public consciousness. Their persistence didn't just keep the pressure on law enforcement. It didn't just maintain public awareness. It didn't just honor their daughter's memory. It helped push Washington State to expand its DNA database, to adopt new technologies faster, to allocate funding to cold case units, a decision that would ultimately crack their daughter's case wide open and solve dozens of others in the years that followed. How did someone with a criminal history slip through investigators' fingers for over a decade? Why did it take a completely unrelated arrest in another state to finally connect the dots? What failures in the system allowed a man who had left his DNA at a scene to remain free for 12 years while innocent people lived under suspicion? This story goes back to October 1996, to a quiet stretch of Route 9 in rural Washington State, where a traveling saleswoman made what seemed like an ordinary decision to stop for the night at a roadside motel, a decision that would end her life and launch an investigation that would span over a decade, involve hundreds of law enforcement officers, generate thousands of tips, ruin reputations, consume resources, and ultimately be solved not through traditional detective work, but through the evolution of technology that didn't fully exist when the incident occurred. Ashford, Washington, in 1996 was the kind of town people passed through without really noticing. Population 217 according to the last census, one main road cutting through the center, a handful of businesses serving travelers heading east toward Mount Rainier National Park or west toward the Pacific Coast, a gas station, a small diner with vinyl booths and a menu that hadn't changed since 1974, a post office that was only open 4 hours a day, and the Pinewood Motel. The Pinewood Motel sat just off Route 9, set back from the road by maybe 50 yards, connected by a gravel driveway that crunched under tires and announced every arrival. It was a single-story, 12-unit property with peeling white paint, forest green doors that had faded to a sickly sage color, and a neon sign that flickered erratically, especially when it rained, which in western Washington was most of the time. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't the kind of place anyone would choose for a romantic getaway or a family vacation, but it was cheap at $42 a night. It was clean enough that guests didn't worry about what might be living in the carpet, and it was convenient for sales representatives covering the rural territories between Seattle and Portland, for truckers who needed a place to sleep between hauls, for families on tight budgets driving across the state. The rooms were identical, queen-size bed with a floral bedspread that had been washed 1,000 times, small television bolted to a dresser, bathroom with a shower stall, and water pressure that varied wildly depending on whether other guests were using their facilities. A round table with 2 chairs positioned by the window, heating unit that rattled and clanked but mostly worked, and a lamp on the bedside table, the base made of cheap ceramic, designed to look like brass. That lamp would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire investigation. The motel was owned by a man named Richard Porter, who lived in Seattle and visited the property maybe 3 times a year. The day-to-day operations were managed by Tom Brennan, a 34-year-old man who had been working at the Pinewood for 6 years, who lived in a small apartment attached to the motel office, who took pride in keeping the place running despite its age and despite the minimal budget he had to work with. Tom was the kind of person who noticed details. He remembered regular guests. He kept meticulous records of repairs and maintenance. He knew which rooms had better water pressure, which had televisions that worked better, which had views of the forest instead of the parking lot. He was friendly but not intrusive, helpful but not overbearing. Guests generally liked him. In October 1996, the Pinewood Motel was operating at about 40% capacity on an average weeknight. Weekends were busier, especially during the summer and early fall, when tourists were heading to Mount Rainier. But by mid-October, as the weather turned colder and the days grew shorter, the flow of travelers slowed to a trickle. This meant that when someone checked in, Tom noticed. He remembered faces, he remembered conversations, and he especially remembered the week of October 8th through October 14th, because that was when a man named Kevin Walsh stayed at the motel. Kevin had arrived on foot, walking up from the direction of town, carrying a duffel bag and asking if there were any rooms available. He paid cash for 3 nights up front. He was polite, quiet, kept to himself. He asked Tom if there was any work available in the area, anything temporary, anything that paid cash. Tom mentioned that he had a leaky faucet in one of the vacant rooms and a section of fence out back that needed repair. Kevin offered to fix both in exchange for a discount on his room rate. Tom agreed. Over the next 3 days, Kevin fixed the faucet, repaired the fence, and even helped Tom replace some rotted boards on the exterior walkway. They talked during those repairs, not about anything significant, just the kind of small talk that fills silence. Kevin mentioned he'd been traveling around the Pacific Northwest looking for work. He'd done construction, landscaping, dishwashing, a little bit of everything. He didn't stay in one place long, seemed like a drifter, but a harmless one. Didn't cause any trouble, paid his bill, left on the morning of October 14th. Tom didn't think about Kevin Walsh again until February 2008, when Detective Sarah Chen showed him a photograph and asked if he recognized the man in the picture. By then, 12 years had passed. By then, the investigation had taken countless turns. By then, 3 innocent men had lived under the shadow of suspicion, while the real perpetrator had been free, moving from state to state, living his life as if nothing had happened. But that's getting ahead of the story. Because before anyone knew Kevin Walsh's name, before DNA technology advanced enough to identify him, before the databases expanded to include his profile, there was October 15th, 1996, and a woman named Rebecca Hartwell, who had no idea that her decision to stop at a roadside motel would be the last decision she would ever make. The Pinewood Motel sat at the intersection of normalcy and tragedy, a place where hundreds of travelers had stopped safely over the years, where families slept peacefully on their way to vacation destinations, where truck drivers caught a few hours of rest before continuing their routes. There was nothing inherently dangerous about the place. The rooms were old but functional. The management was attentive. The location was convenient. But on one particular night, a convergence of circumstances, a series of seemingly unrelated decisions, and the presence of one person with harmful intent would transform this unremarkable roadside motel into the site of an incident that would haunt a community for over a decade. The irony of the situation, the detail that would later cause investigators endless frustration, was how close they came to preventing what happened. If Tom Brennan had been more suspicious of Kevin Walsh during his stay the previous week, if he'd reported something unusual about the man's behavior, if he'd noticed Kevin paying too much attention to the motel's layout or routines, perhaps things would have unfolded differently. But Kevin Walsh was skilled at blending in, at presenting himself as just another, down-on-his-luck traveler, looking for work and a place to stay. He'd been doing it for years, moving from town to town, taking odd jobs, staying just long enough to earn a little money before moving on. He knew how to be forgettable, how to avoid drawing attention, how to seem harmless. The Pinewood Motel, with its peeling paint and flickering sign, its threadbare carpets and aging furniture, represented the kind of establishment where Walsh felt comfortable. No one asked too many questions at places like this. Cash was king. Privacy was respected. As long as guests paid and didn't cause problems, they were left alone. Tom Brennan had no reason to be suspicious of Kevin Walsh. The man had done good work on the repairs. He'd been polite. He'd paid his bill without complaint when he checked out on the morning of October 14th. Tom had actually felt a small sense of satisfaction at having found someone reliable to help with the maintenance tasks that were constantly piling up. Tom had even mentioned to Kevin that if he was ever back in the area and needed a place to stay, he'd be welcome at the Pinewood. It was the kind of casual offer that people make without thinking much about it, a gesture of goodwill towards someone who'd been helpful. Kevin had nodded, thanked Tom for the work, and walked away down the gravel driveway, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder, heading back towards the town. Tom watched him go, then returned to the office to update his maintenance log. Another task completed, another small problem solved. Neither man knew that less than 24 hours later, Kevin Walsh would return to the Pinewood Motel under very different circumstances, with very different intentions. Rebecca Ann Hartwell was born on March the 3rd, 1967, in Tacoma, Washington, to Linda and Michael Hartwell. She was their first child, arriving after 3 years of marriage, during which Linda and Michael had established themselves in their careers and their community. Linda worked as a nurse at Tacoma General Hospital. Michael was a high school mathematics teacher. They lived in a modest house in a working-class neighborhood, the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's names and kids played in the streets until the streetlights came on. Rebecca's arrival brought tremendous joy to the Hartwell household. She was, by all accounts, an easy baby. She slept through the night early. She smiled often. She reached her developmental milestones on schedule. Linda and Michael documented her early years meticulously, filling photo albums with pictures of first steps, first words, first days of school. 3 years after Rebecca was born, the family welcomed Sarah, a second daughter who would become Rebecca's closest friend and confidant. The two sisters were different in many ways. Rebecca was methodical and organized, the kind of child who color-coded her school supplies and kept her room immaculately clean. Sarah was more spontaneous, more artistic, more likely to start projects without finishing them. But despite their differences, or perhaps because of them, the sisters were inseparable growing up. They shared a bedroom until Rebecca left for college. They told each other secrets. They defended each other against bullies. They formed the kind of bond that only siblings who genuinely like each other can form. Growing up in Tacoma in the 1970s and 1980s meant a childhood defined by a certain kind of Pacific Northwest normalcy. Rainy days spent indoors, reading or playing board games. Summer vacations to the coast or the mountains. Friday night high school football games. Sunday dinners with extended family. Rebecca attended Wilson Elementary School, where she quickly established herself as a diligent student. Her report cards were consistently excellent. Her teachers wrote comments praising her work ethic, her attention to detail, her willingness to help other students who were struggling. She wasn't necessarily the smartest kid in her class, but she was often the hardest working, the one who would spend extra time on assignments to make sure they were perfect. In middle school, Rebecca joined the band, playing clarinet. She wasn't particularly talented musically, but she enjoyed the structure of practice and performance, the clear progression from simpler pieces to more complex ones. She liked that if she practiced enough, if she put in the hours, she would improve. It was a principle that would define much of her approach to life. High school brought new challenges and opportunities. Rebecca continued with band, but also joined the swim team. Swimming appealed to her in the same way music did. It was about repetition, about technique, about gradual improvement through consistent effort. She would never be the fastest swimmer on the team, but she was reliable, showing up to every practice, pushing herself to beat her own previous times, if not necessarily those of her competitors. Academically, Rebecca excelled in the sciences. Biology and chemistry particularly captured her interest. She liked the precision of scientific method, the way experiments could be designed to test specific hypotheses, the satisfaction of getting clear answers to well-formulated questions. Her high school biology teacher, Mrs. Patterson, recognized Rebecca's aptitude and encouraged her to consider studying science in college. Rebecca's social life in high school was typical for a student focused primarily on academics and extracurricular activities. She had a close group of friends, mostly other girls from band and swim team. She went to school dances. She attended parties occasionally. She dated a boy named Travis for most of her junior year, though the relationship ended amicably when they realized they were better as friends. What stands out when talking to people who knew Rebecca during these years is consistency. She was consistently kind, consistently hardworking, consistently present. She wasn't the kind of person who stood out dramatically. She wasn't the most popular student or the most brilliant or the most athletic. But she was steady, reliable, the kind of person people appreciated, even if they didn't always notice her. When it came time to apply to colleges, Rebecca chose Washington State University in Pullman, about 280 miles from Tacoma. It was far enough to feel like she was gaining independence, close enough that she could come home for holidays and long weekends. She declared biology as her major, still thinking she might go to medical school after graduation. College life suited Rebecca well. She thrived in the more independent academic environment where students were expected to manage their own time and take responsibility for their own learning. She joined a study group during her first semester, a collection of biology majors who met regularly to review material and prepare for exams. Several members of that study group remained her closest friends throughout her 4 years at WSU. During her junior year, Rebecca took an elective course in pharmacology, and something clicked: the study of how drugs interact with biological systems, how medications are developed and tested, how they're prescribed and monitored, fascinated her in a way that general medicine hadn't. She liked the intersection of chemistry and biology, the precision required in pharmaceutical development, the direct impact that medications could have on patient outcomes. She began to reconsider her plan to attend medical school. Medical school would mean 4 more years of education, then residency, then potentially fellowship training. It would mean accumulating significant debt. It would mean being in her 30s before she was fully established in her career. Pharmaceutical sales, on the other hand, offered a way to work in healthcare without the extensive additional education. It would allow her to use her science background to interact with healthcare professionals, to play a role in getting important medications to patients who needed them, and it would provide a stable income right after graduation. Rebecca discussed this decision extensively with her parents during her senior year. Linda and Michael were supportive, recognizing that their daughter had thought carefully about her options. If pharmaceutical sales was what Rebecca wanted to pursue, they would support her. After graduating from Washington State University in 1989 with a bachelor's degree in biology, Rebecca returned to Tacoma and began job hunting. She sent applications to several pharmaceutical companies, with offices in the Seattle-Tacoma area. She prepared for interviews by researching each company's product lines and market position. She practiced answering common interview questions with Sarah, who was then a sophomore at the University of Washington. In June 1989, Rebecca received a job offer from MediSource Solutions, a mid-sized pharmaceutical company based in Tacoma. The position was entry-level sales representative, covering a rural territory south of Seattle. The salary was modest but livable. More importantly, it was an opportunity to prove herself, to build a track record, to potentially advance within the company. Rebecca accepted the offer immediately. The first few months in the position were challenging. Sales, Rebecca discovered, required a different skill set than academic success. It wasn't enough to know the science behind the products, though that was important. She also had to build relationships with doctors, pharmacists, and clinic staff. She had to learn to read people, to understand what motivated them, to present information in ways that resonated with different audiences. She also had to adjust to the lifestyle of a traveling sales representative. Long hours in the car driving between appointments, meals eaten alone at diners and fast food restaurants, nights spent in budget motels far from home. It was lonely sometimes, especially in those first months when she was still establishing her territory and hadn't yet built the relationships that would make the work more personally rewarding. But Rebecca approached this new challenge the same way she'd approached everything else in her life, with methodical effort and steady determination. She kept detailed notes on every doctor and pharmacist in her territory. She remembered personal details, asking about kids and hobbies and upcoming vacations. She followed up on every conversation, sending relevant information, checking in regularly. Gradually, her sales numbers began to improve. By her second year with MediSource Solutions, she was consistently meeting her targets. By her third year, she was exceeding them. Her territory, which had been underperforming when she inherited it, was now one of the company's strongest. Rebecca's success didn't go unnoticed. She received commendations from management. She was invited to speak at company training sessions for new hires, sharing her strategies for building client relationships. She was featured in the company newsletter as an example of what dedicated effort could achieve. But while her professional life was thriving, her personal life was becoming complicated. In 1991, at a barbecue hosted by mutual friends, Rebecca met Derek Hartwell. Derek was 30 years old, 2 years older than Rebecca, working as an IT consultant for various companies in the Seattle area. He was charming, funny, attentive. He called when he said he would call. He remembered details from their conversations. He seemed genuinely interested in Rebecca's work and her goals. They began dating in August 1991. Derek was everything Rebecca thought she wanted in a partner. He was educated, employed, ambitious. He talked about wanting to settle down, about wanting a family someday. He introduced Rebecca to his parents within the first few months of dating, a gesture that suggested seriousness. After a year of dating, Derek proposed. They were at a restaurant overlooking Puget Sound, and Derek had arranged with the staff to have the ring brought out with dessert. It was romantic, thoughtful, exactly the kind of gesture that Rebecca appreciated. They married in September 1992 in a small ceremony at a church in Tacoma. Linda and Michael hosted a reception at their house for about 50 people, family and close friends. Sarah was maid of honor. Derek's brother was best man. The wedding was lovely, simple, focused more on the commitment than on elaborate displays. The first year of marriage was happy. Rebecca and Derek rented a small house in a suburb between Tacoma and Seattle, splitting the distance between their work territories. They fell into routines. Derek cooked breakfast on weekends. Rebecca handled the grocery shopping. They took turns doing laundry. They went to movies on Friday nights, when Rebecca wasn't traveling for work. But as the second year began, cracks started to show. Derek began to resent the amount of time Rebecca spent traveling for work. He would make comments about how she was never home, about how he felt like he barely saw her. Rebecca tried to explain that the travel was part of the job, that her territory was large and required her to spend several nights a week away from home. Derek's comments became more pointed. He started suggesting that Rebecca should look for a different job, something that didn't require travel. He brought it up during arguments about household responsibilities, about social commitments they'd missed, about plans that had to be changed because Rebecca was out of town. Then Derek began to question where Rebecca was actually going, who she was actually meeting. He would call her motel rooms late at night, ostensibly just to check in, but his questions suggested suspicion. Was she really alone? Were her client meetings really all work-related? How could he be sure she wasn't seeing someone else? Rebecca was shocked and hurt by these accusations. She had never been unfaithful, had never even been tempted. Her late nights in motel rooms were spent reviewing materials for the next day's appointments, catching up on paperwork, or sleeping because she was exhausted. The idea that Derek didn't trust her, after everything they'd built together, was devastating. She tried to reassure him. She offered to call him at specific times each evening when she was traveling. She invited him to come along on some of her trips so he could see what her days actually looked like. She suggested couples counseling to work through his trust issues. Derek refused counseling. He said he didn't need therapy, that Rebecca was the one with the problem. If she would just get a different job, if she would just be home more, everything would be fine. But Rebecca loved her job. She was good at it. She was being considered for a promotion to senior account manager, a position that would come with a significant raise and more responsibility. Why should she give that up because Derek was insecure? The arguments became more frequent and more heated. Derek accused Rebecca of caring more about her career than about their marriage. Rebecca countered that a healthy marriage should support both partners' professional goals. Derek said she was selfish. Rebecca said he was controlling. By early 1996, it was clear the marriage wasn't working. They'd tried to fix it. They'd had countless conversations about expectations and needs and compromises. But nothing changed. Derek continued to resent Rebecca's career. Rebecca continued to feel that Derek was trying to limit her potential. In February 1996, after 4 years of marriage, Rebecca moved out. She rented a small apartment in Tacoma, taking only what she needed: clothes, a few pieces of furniture, her work materials. She left behind the wedding photos, the gifts they'd received, the accumulated possessions of their shared life. Derek was furious. He hadn't expected Rebecca to actually leave. He thought if he pushed hard enough, she would give in, would quit her job or at least reduce her travel, would prioritize the marriage the way he thought she should. But Rebecca was done. She filed for divorce in March 1996. Derek contested it immediately. He wanted half of everything. Half the equity in the house they'd bought together, half of Rebecca's retirement accounts, half of the value of her car. He refused to sign the papers. He dragged out every procedural step. His lawyer sent aggressive letters to Rebecca's lawyer. Derek showed up at Rebecca's apartment unannounced, wanting to talk, though these conversations inevitably turned into arguments. He called her at work, disrupting her day with emotional confrontations. Rebecca tried to remain professional through all of this. She showed up to her client appointments prepared and focused. She hit her sales targets. She participated in company meetings and training sessions. But people who worked closely with her noticed the strain. She looked tired. She seemed distracted sometimes. The lightness that had characterized her personality seemed diminished. Sarah, who talked to Rebecca regularly during this period, later described her sister as being in survival mode. Rebecca was getting through each day, each week, each month. But there wasn't much joy in it. She was waiting for the divorce to be finalized, waiting to be able to move forward with her life, waiting for this painful chapter to end. The divorce proceedings dragged on through spring and summer of 1996. Lawyers exchanged paperwork, financial documents were reviewed and contested. Arguments were made about who deserved what portion of the marital assets. By October, after 8 months of legal wrangling, there was still no resolution. Derek continued to contest every detail. Rebecca's lawyer advised patience, said these things sometimes took time, said eventually Derek would have to accept reality. Meanwhile, Rebecca's professional life continued. She was still being considered for the promotion to senior account manager. The decision hadn't been made yet, but Rebecca remained a strong candidate. Her sales numbers were excellent. Her relationships with clients were strong. She had the support of her regional manager. On October 15, 1996, Rebecca had a full schedule of client appointments. It was a Tuesday. An ordinary day of work. She would meet with doctors and pharmacists, discuss medications and prescribing patterns, take orders and address concerns. It was the kind of day she'd had hundreds of times before. She had no reason to think this day would be any different. She had no idea that her decision to stop at a roadside motel that evening, a decision made simply because it was more convenient than driving all the way home, would be the last decision she would ever make. Rebecca Hartwell was 29 years old. She had graduated from college, established a successful career, navigated the pain of a failed marriage. She had plans for the future. She wanted to travel more. She thought about eventually going back to school for an advanced degree. She talked about maybe moving to Seattle, about buying a condo downtown, about building a life that was entirely her own. All of those possibilities, all of those future chapters, would end in room 7 of the Pinewood Motel. October 15th, 1996, was a Tuesday. The weather in western Washington was typical for mid-October. Overcast, cool, with intermittent light rain. The kind of day where the sky never really gets bright, where dusk seems to arrive gradually throughout the afternoon, rather than suddenly at evening. Rebecca Hartwell woke up at 6:15 a.m. in her apartment in Tacoma. Her alarm was set for 6 o'clock, but she'd hit snooze twice. A small indulgence she allowed herself on mornings when she didn't have an early appointment. By 6:15, though, she knew she needed to get moving if she wanted to stay on schedule. She showered quickly, the water as hot as she could stand it, trying to wake herself up fully. She dressed in professional casual clothes, navy blue blazer, khaki pants, low-heeled shoes, comfortable enough for a day that would involve considerable walking between her car and various medical offices and clinics. She dried her hair and pulled it back in a ponytail, practical and professional. In the kitchen, she made coffee and toast, standing at the counter while she reviewed her day planner. 3 appointments scheduled: Enumclaw at 9:30 a.m., Buckley at 11:30 a.m., Eatonville at 2 p.m. She'd planned the route to minimize driving time between locations. If everything stayed on schedule, she'd be done by 4 o'clock or 4:30 p.m. Then she'd have a decision to make. She could drive back to Tacoma, about a 90-minute drive from Eatonville, arriving home around 6:00 p.m. Or she could find a motel somewhere along Route 9 and stay overnight, since she had another appointment in Packwood the following morning, about 60 miles south of Eatonville. The efficient choice was obvious. Staying overnight would mean waking up much closer to her morning appointment, would mean not having to drive back to Tacoma, only to leave early again the next day. It would save time, save gas, save wear and tear on her car. Rebecca decided she'd probably stay overnight somewhere. She packed her small rolling suitcase with everything she'd need: change of clothes for the next day, toiletries, phone charger, a book in case she had time to read before bed. She added her briefcase with her laptop, sales materials, and the files she'd need for her appointments. By 7:00 a.m., she was in her car, a silver 1994 Honda Accord, pulling out of her apartment complex parking lot. Traffic was light heading south out of Tacoma. She turned on the radio to a news station, half listening to reports about local politics, national stories, weather forecasts. She arrived at the clinic in Enumclaw, right on schedule at 9:30 a.m. The medical practice was small, just 2 doctors and a nurse practitioner, serving a rural community. Rebecca had been working with them for about 2 years. They trusted her recommendations and had consistently prescribed medications from her company's product line. Dr. Patricia Reynolds was the physician Rebecca met with that morning. They discussed a new medication for managing hypertension that MediSource Solutions had recently brought to market. Rebecca provided clinical studies showing its effectiveness. Dr. Reynolds asked intelligent questions about side effects, about interactions with other common medications, about cost compared to existing options. The meeting lasted 45 minutes and went well. Dr. Reynolds said she'd consider prescribing the new medication for appropriate patients. She thanked Rebecca for always providing thorough, evidence-based information. They confirmed their next meeting in 6 weeks. Rebecca left the clinic feeling satisfied. These were the appointments she enjoyed most, where she felt like she was genuinely helping connect doctors with tools that would improve their patients' health outcomes. It wasn't just sales, it was education. It was building relationships based on mutual respect and shared goals. The drive from Enumclaw to Buckley took about 25 minutes through rural countryside. Small farms, tree-covered hills, the occasional small town with a gas station and a post office. The rain had stopped, though the sky remained overcast. In Buckley, Rebecca met with Frank Chen, the owner and pharmacist at Buckley Pharmacy. This was more of a business meeting than a clinical discussion. They talked about inventory levels, about promotional materials for the upcoming flu season, about pricing and delivery schedules. Frank ordered several cases of flu vaccines and some other common prescriptions. He mentioned he was thinking about expanding his pharmacy's hours to include Sunday mornings, asked Rebecca's opinion on whether that would be worthwhile. Rebecca said she thought it would depend on the community's needs, that he should probably survey his customers. They had lunch together at a small restaurant next to the pharmacy, sandwiches and soup. They talked about Frank's family, his kids who were in high school, his wife who taught music. It was pleasant, the kind of easy conversation that comes from having known someone professionally for several years. Rebecca left Buckley at 1:00 p.m., giving herself an hour to drive to Eatonville for her 2:00 p.m. appointment. She stopped at a gas station to fill up her tank and buy a bottle of water. She called her voicemail from a payphone to check messages. There were 3, all work-related. She made notes about who to call back and when. The appointment in Eatonville was at the Eatonville Medical Center with Dr. James Morrison. This was a follow-up to a previous meeting where Dr. Morrison had expressed concerns about side effects associated with one of MediSource Solutions' cardiac medications. Rebecca came prepared with recent research studies, patient outcome data, and documentation of the medication's safety profile. She took Dr. Morrison's concerns seriously, addressing each one specifically, acknowledging where uncertainty existed, providing honest assessments of risks and benefits. Dr. Morrison appreciated Rebecca's approach. He said he sometimes dealt with pharmaceutical reps who tried to downplay any negative information about their products. Rebecca's willingness to have an honest conversation, to acknowledge limitations, while also presenting the full picture, made him more inclined to trust her recommendations. The meeting lasted 90 minutes. By the time Rebecca left the medical center, it was 3:45 p.m. She sat in her car for a moment, reviewing her day planner, confirming what she already knew. Her next appointment was in Packwood at 9:00 a.m. the following morning. She pulled out a map and calculated distances. Packwood was about 60 miles south. If she drove there tonight, she'd arrive around 5:30 or 6 p.m., giving her time to find a motel, get dinner, and prepare for the morning appointment. Alternatively, she could drive back to Tacoma, arriving around 6:30 or 7 p.m., then wake up early the next morning to drive to Packwood, probably needing to leave by 7 a.m. to be safe. The choice was clear. Staying overnight made more sense. She started her car and headed south on Route 9. At 4:45 p.m. while driving, Rebecca called her sister Sarah from her car phone. Sarah was at home in Seattle, preparing dinner for her boyfriend. The sisters talked for about 6 minutes. Sarah asked how Rebecca's day had gone. Rebecca said it had been good, productive meetings, felt like she was really helping connect patients with medications that could improve their health. Sarah asked where Rebecca was staying that night. Rebecca said she was looking for a motel along Route 9, somewhere between where she was now and where she needed to be in the morning. Sarah asked if Rebecca had heard anything new about the divorce. Rebecca said no, Derek was still contesting everything, still dragging it out. Sarah said something dismissive about Derek being immature. Rebecca laughed, agreed, said she just wanted it to be over. They talked about getting together that weekend if Rebecca was back in town, maybe brunch on Sunday. Sarah said her boyfriend wanted to check out a new restaurant in Capitol Hill. Rebecca said that sounded good. She'd call later in the week to confirm. They said they loved each other. They hung up. That was the last conversation Sarah would ever have with her sister. At 5:17 p.m., Rebecca's car pulled into the parking lot of the Pinewood Motel. The neon sign flickered in the gathering dusk. Only 3 other cars were in the lot. Room 4 had a pickup truck parked in front. Room 9 had a sedan. Room 11 had a station wagon. Rebecca parked near the office and went inside. Tom Brennan was behind the desk, updating his logbook. He looked up when the door opened, saw a woman in business attire carrying a briefcase. "Good evening," he said. "Checking in?" "Yes, please, just for one night." Tom pulled out his registration form. "Single or double bed?" "Single is fine." "That'll be $42. Rebecca paid with her corporate credit card. Tom processed it manually with the imprint machine, the way all transactions were handled before electronic systems became standard. He handed her the receipt to sign. "You're in room 7, he said, handing her a key, attached to a plastic tag with the room number. Straight down the walkway, 4th door on the left. Checkout is 11 a.m. If you need anything, I'm here until 10. Then I'm in the apartment attached to the office. Just knock if there's a problem." Rebecca thanked him and returned to her car. She drove it down to park directly in front of room 7, grabbed her suitcase and briefcase from the trunk, and let herself into the room. The room was exactly as expected, clean but worn. The bedspread had been washed so many times the pattern was faded. The carpet showed traffic patterns despite regular vacuuming. The heating unit rattled when she turned it on, but it was warm, dry, and sufficient for one night. Rebecca set her briefcase on the table by the window. She hung her blazer in the small closet. She kicked off her shoes. She sat on the edge of the bed and picked up the phone, checking her voicemail again. 2 new messages, both from clients confirming upcoming appointments. At 6:30 p.m. she walked to the diner about half a mile down the road. She ordered a cheeseburger and fries, ate while reading a magazine she'd brought with her, paid the bill, walked back to the motel. By 7:45 p.m. she was back in room 7. She changed into comfortable clothes, sweatpants and a t-shirt. She spread her materials for the next morning's appointment across the table. She reviewed her notes, checking that she had everything she needed. At 8:30 p.m. she called her parents. Linda answered. They talked for about 15 minutes. Rebecca told them about her day, about her appointments, about where she was staying. Linda asked if the motel was clean and safe. Rebecca said it was fine, nothing fancy but perfectly adequate. Michael got on the line. He asked about the divorce proceedings. Rebecca said her lawyer thought they were making progress, that Derek would eventually have to accept the settlement offer. Michael said he hoped it would be resolved soon, that Rebecca deserved to move forward with her life. Rebecca said she was tired, was going to watch some TV and go to bed early, since she had a 9:00 a.m. appointment. They said goodnight. They told her they loved her. She said she loved them too. By 9:15 p.m. Rebecca was sitting on the bed, the television tuned to a sitcom she wasn't really watching. She was thinking about the promotion, about whether she should push her regional manager for a decision or wait patiently. She was thinking about her apartment lease, which would be up for renewal in December, about whether she should stay there or look for something different. She was thinking about ordinary things, about the mundane details of a life in progress. She had no way of knowing that Kevin Walsh was outside her window. At 7:23 a.m. on October 16th, 1996, the housekeeper at the Pinewood Motel, Maria Santos, knocked on the door of room 7. She'd seen Rebecca Hartwell's car still parked outside and assumed the guest was sleeping late or had left the "Do Not Disturb" sign out. But checkout was at 11, and Maria had a full day of rooms to clean. She knocked again, louder this time. "Housekeeping," she called. No response. Maria used her master key and opened the door. What she saw made her drop the stack of towels she was carrying. The room had been ransacked, dresser drawers pulled out and dumped on the floor. The contents of Rebecca's suitcase scattered across the carpet. The table overturned. Papers everywhere. The lamp from the bedside table was on the floor, its ceramic base cracked, and Rebecca Hartwell was gone from this world. Maria screamed and ran to the office. Tom Brennan called 911 at 7:26 a.m. The Lewis County Sheriff's Department dispatched Deputy Mark Richardson, who arrived at the Pinewood Motel at 7:41 a.m. Tom met him in the parking lot and led him to room 7. Richardson entered the room carefully, immediately recognizing this was a serious incident. He backed out, secured the door, called for backup and detectives, and began establishing a perimeter. Detective James Walsh, no relation to Kevin Walsh, though that coincidence would later cause confusion in media reports, arrived at 8:15 a.m., along with the county medical examiner and a forensic investigation team. The preliminary examination revealed that Rebecca had lost her life during a violent encounter. There were signs she had fought back. The medical examiner estimated the time frame between 10 p.m. and midnight the previous night. The room showed signs of both a physical altercation and a subsequent search. Whoever had been there had gone through Rebecca's belongings, though it wasn't immediately clear what, if anything, had been taken. Her car keys were on the floor near the door. Her wallet was found under the bed, with cash and credit cards still inside. Her laptop was still in its case. The broken lamp drew particular attention. Its base had shattered when it hit the floor, and there was blood on one of the ceramic fragments, not Rebecca's blood type, which meant it likely belonged to someone else who had been in that room. This would turn out to be the most important piece of evidence in the entire case. You're watching something extraordinary unfold here. A case that would change how law enforcement approaches cold investigations forever. If you're as invested in this story as we are, do us a favor and hit that like button right now. And if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? We cover cases like this that deserve to be remembered, victims who deserve justice, and families who deserve answers. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and drop a comment below telling us what you think investigators should have done differently. Your engagement keeps these stories alive. Detective Walsh and his team photographed the scene meticulously. They collected the lamp fragments, carefully preserving the blood evidence. They took fingerprints from surfaces throughout the room. They bagged Rebecca's belongings as evidence. They measured, documented, recorded every detail. Tom Brennan provided Detective Walsh with the registration records. He explained that Rebecca had checked in around 5:20 p.m. the previous day, had seemed completely normal, hadn't mentioned expecting any visitors or having any concerns. Tom was asked about other guests. Who else was staying at the motel that night? Room 4, a truck driver named Robert Martinez, who was passing through on his way to Portland. He'd checked in around 4 p.m., hadn't left his room except to get ice. Around 9:30 p.m., had checked out early that morning, around 6 a.m. Room 9, an elderly couple, the Johnsons, celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary with a road trip up the coast. They checked in around 3 p.m., had gone to dinner at the local diner, returned around 8 p.m., hadn't left their room again. Room 11, a man named David Pierce, who said he was traveling for work. He'd checked in around 6 p.m., had stayed in his room all evening. All three parties were contacted immediately and asked to remain available for questioning. Detective Walsh also asked Tom if he'd seen anyone suspicious around the property the previous evening. Anyone who wasn't a registered guest. Anyone lurking in the parking lot or near the rooms. Tom said no, he hadn't noticed anything unusual. But he also admitted that after 10 p.m., he'd been in his apartment watching television with his headphones on because he didn't want to disturb guests with the noise. He wouldn't have heard someone walking through the parking lot or approaching one of the rooms. The investigation moved quickly in those first hours. Robert Martinez, the truck driver, was cleared almost immediately. His truck had an electronic logging device that showed he'd stopped his vehicle at 3:47 p.m. and hadn't started it again until 5:52 a.m. Unless he'd walked to room 7 and walked back, or while leaving no trace evidence in his own room. He couldn't have been involved. The elderly couple was similarly ruled out. Both were in their 70s with significant health issues. Neither had the physical capability to overpower a healthy 29-year-old woman who had clearly fought back. That left David Pierce. Pierce was questioned at the motel at 10:30 a.m. on October 16th. He was 34 years old, worked as a freelance IT consultant, had been traveling through the area on his way to a client meeting in Oregon. He'd paid cash for his room, which Detective Walsh noted but didn't find immediately suspicious, since many travelers in 1996 still preferred cash. Pierce said he'd spent the evening in his room working on his laptop, preparing for his client meeting. He'd heard nothing unusual, hadn't seen anyone suspicious, hadn't left his room after checking in. except once around 9 p.m. to get a soda from the vending machine near the office. Detective Walsh asked if Pierce would consent to having his fingerprints taken for elimination purposes. Pierce agreed. He also agreed to a search of his room and his vehicle. The search revealed nothing connecting him to the incident, no evidence on his clothing or shoes. No items linking him to room 7. His story seemed to check out, but Detective Walsh wasn't ready to eliminate Pierce entirely. There was something about his demeanor, a nervous energy that could have been innocent anxiety about being questioned in a serious investigation, or could have been something else. Walsh asked Pierce to remain available for further questioning and not to leave the state. The investigation expanded rapidly. Detectives canvassed nearby businesses, asking if anyone had seen anything unusual the previous evening. They reviewed Rebecca's call records, trying to identify everyone she'd spoken with in the days before. They contacted MediSource Solutions to understand Rebecca's work schedule, her clients, anyone she might have had conflicts with. They also began looking into Rebecca's personal life. The divorce proceedings with Derek Hartwell immediately became a focus. An estranged husband, especially one involved in contentious divorce proceedings, was always a person of interest in cases like this. Derek was contacted at his workplace on the afternoon of October 16th and asked to come to the sheriff's department for a conversation. He arrived with his lawyer, immediately establishing a defensive posture. The discussion lasted 3 hours. Derek denied any involvement. He said he'd been at home alone the previous evening, had fallen asleep watching television around 10 p.m., had woken up around 7 a.m. He had no witnesses to corroborate his whereabouts. Detective Walsh asked Derek about the status of the divorce. Derek admitted it had been contentious, that he and Rebecca had been arguing about the division of assets, that he'd been frustrated by the proceedings, but he insisted he would never harm Rebecca, that despite their problems, he still cared about her. The detectives asked if Derek owned any weapons. He said no. They asked if he'd ever been aggressive with Rebecca during their marriage. He said no, absolutely not. They asked if he'd been to the Pinewood Motel or anywhere near Ashford recently. He said no, he'd never even heard of the place before today. Derek's lawyer ended the conversation, stating that his client had cooperated fully and would continue to cooperate, but would not be available for further discussion without advance notice. After Derek left, Detective Walsh reviewed his impressions with his team. Derek had motive: the divorce, the financial disputes, the anger at Rebecca for leaving. He had no alibi for the critical time period, but there was no physical evidence connecting him to the scene, no witnesses placing him at the motel, no clear path from suspicion to prosecution. Still, Derek Hartwell remained a person of interest. The third person who drew investigative attention was someone Rebecca had dated briefly after separating from Derek. His name was Michael Chen, and he was a pharmacist Rebecca had met through her work. They'd gone on perhaps 5 or 6 dates between April and June 1996. Rebecca had ended it, telling Michael she wasn't ready for a relationship while her divorce was still pending. Michael had accepted this, or so it seemed, but investigators learned from Rebecca's friends that Michael had continued to call her occasionally, asking if she'd changed her mind, suggesting they try again. Michael was brought in for questioning on October 17th. He was cooperative, seemed genuinely shocked and saddened by what had happened to Rebecca. He said yes, he'd been interested in pursuing a relationship with Rebecca, but he'd respected her decision to focus on getting through her divorce. He hadn't seen her in months. He'd last spoken to her by phone in early September, and their conversation had been brief and friendly. Michael provided an alibi, He'd been at a continuing education seminar in Seattle on October 15th, attending lectures from 1 o'clock p.m. until 8 o'clock p.m., then had gone to dinner with colleagues afterward. Multiple people could confirm his presence. Detectives verified his alibi. It held up completely. Michael Chen was eliminated as a person of interest. By October 20th, 4 days after Rebecca's body was discovered, the investigation had generated hundreds of pages of reports, dozens of conversations, extensive forensic analysis. But there was no clear suspect. The blood on the lamp fragment was sent to the state laboratory for analysis. In 1996, DNA testing was available, but not yet as advanced as it would become. The sample was tested and a profile was developed, but there was nothing to compare it to. David Pierce and Derek Hartwell had both provided DNA samples voluntarily, and neither matched the blood on the lamp. That blood belonged to someone else. Someone who had been in room 7. Someone who had been involved in what happened to Rebecca. Someone whose DNA was now on file, waiting for a match that wouldn't come for 12 years. The investigation into Rebecca Hartwell's case didn't end in those first weeks or months. Detective Walsh continued pursuing leads well into 1997. He re-interviewed witnesses. He followed up on tips called in to the department's hotline. He reviewed and re-reviewed the evidence, looking for something he might have missed. But as weeks turned to months, and months stretched into a year, the case began to cool. Not because investigators stopped caring, but because there was nowhere left to go. Every lead had been exhausted. Every person of interest had been investigated and cleared or remained under suspicion, but without sufficient evidence for charges. The DNA from the lamp was the best evidence they had, but it pointed to no one in their database. In 1998, Detective Walsh transferred to a different unit. The Rebecca Hartwell case was reassigned to Detective Maria Rodriguez, who reviewed everything with fresh eyes, hoping to find an angle her predecessor had missed. She found nothing new. David Pierce, the IT consultant who'd been staying in room 11, remained a person of interest, but never more than that. He'd moved to California for a job opportunity. Detectives kept tabs on him periodically, but he never did anything that suggested involvement. He got married. He had kids. He lived what appeared to be a completely normal life. Derek Hartwell also moved on, though his progression was messier. The divorce proceedings were terminated due to Rebecca's passing, and Derek inherited her estate by default since they were still legally married. This caused tremendous pain for Rebecca's family, who felt Derek shouldn't benefit financially from her loss. But legally there was nothing they could do. Derek sold the house he and Rebecca had owned together. He moved to Oregon. He got remarried in 2001, and he lived with the shadow of suspicion hanging over him, with people in his life wondering if he'd gotten away with something terrible, though he was never charged. For Linda, Michael, and Sarah Hartwell, the years after Rebecca's passing were defined by grief and frustration. They attended initial hearings when investigators thought they had enough to bring charges against Derek, only to watch the case fall apart for lack of evidence. They held annual memorial services for Rebecca, keeping her memory alive even as media attention faded. They advocated for better funding, for cold case investigations and forensic technology. Sarah, in particular, became an activist of sorts. She spoke at criminal justice conferences about the impact of unsolved cases on families. She lobbied state legislators to expand DNA databases and require all convicted individuals to provide samples, not just those involved in certain types of offenses. She wrote letters to newspapers, keeping Rebecca's story in public consciousness, and she waited. They all waited. For years, the DNA from the lamp sat in an evidence locker, periodically run through CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, hoping for a match. But DNA databases in the late 1990s and early 2000s were much smaller than they would later become. Many states weren't yet requiring DNA samples from all offenders. Many older cases hadn't yet had their evidence tested and uploaded. The technology existed to solve the case. The evidence existed, but the connection remained invisible. In 2003, the Pinewood Motel closed permanently. The owner, Richard Porter, had let the property deteriorate over the years, and the cost of bringing it up to code exceeded what he was willing to invest. The motel sat vacant for 2 years before being demolished in 2005 to make way for a gas station. The physical place where Rebecca had lost her life was erased, but the case remained open. In 2006, Detective Sarah Chen joined the Lewis County Sheriff's Department. Chen was 28 years old, ambitious, methodical. She'd grown up in Seattle, had studied criminal justice at the University of Washington, and had specifically sought a position where she could work cold cases. When she reviewed the open case files, the Rebecca Hartwell investigation immediately captured her attention. The evidence was solid. The investigation had been thorough, but something was missing. Some connection that hadn't yet been made. Chen requested permission to resubmit the DNA evidence for testing using newer, more sensitive techniques. Permission was granted. The sample was sent to a private forensic laboratory that specialized in cold cases. The testing confirmed what was already known, the DNA profile from the blood on the lamp. But now that profile could be run through databases that had expanded significantly since 1996, databases that included millions of samples from convicted offenders across multiple states. On February 3, 2008, Detective Chen received a phone call from the lab. They had a match. The DNA belonged to Kevin Walsh, a 42-year-old man who had been arrested in Idaho in December 2007 for burglary. As part of that arrest, his DNA had been collected and uploaded to CODIS. The system had flagged a match to the Unsolved case in Washington. Detective Chen immediately pulled everything she could find on Kevin Walsh. His record was extensive. Petty theft in 1989, burglary in 1992, assault in 1995. Each time had resulted in relatively short periods of incarceration, never more than 2 years. He'd been released, moved to a new state, committed new offenses. He was the kind of person who slipped through cracks, who wasn't considered serious enough for intensive monitoring, who took advantage of the lack of coordination between jurisdictions. Chen noticed something in Walsh's record from October 1996. A misdemeanor charge for trespassing in Oregon, just 40 miles from Ashford, Washington. The charge had been filed on October 18th, 3 days after Rebecca's passing. She dug deeper. Where had Walsh been in October 1996? She contacted police departments in Washington and Oregon, requesting any reports involving him during that time period. A report from Woodland, Washington, filed on October 10th, 1996, documented a complaint from a motel owner about a man who'd been loitering around the property. The man had left before police arrived, but the description matched Walsh. Another report from Castle Rock, Washington, dated October 12th, mentioned a man matching Walsh's description who'd been seen walking along Route 9. Chen felt the pieces beginning to align. Walsh had been in the area. He'd been at or near motels. He'd been moving through the exact region where Rebecca had been staying. Then Chen remembered something from the original case file. she pulled out Tom Brennan's statement from October 16th, 1996. Detective Walsh's notes included a passing reference. Brennan states a transient worker had stayed at the motel earlier that week, October 8th to 14th, helped with repairs, paid cash, no formal registration after first night. Chen called Tom Brennan, who was now 60 years old and working at a different property in Tacoma. She asked if he remembered the transient worker from October 1996. Tom's memory was vague after 12 years, but when Chen described Kevin Walsh and showed him a photograph, something clicked. "Yeah," Tom said slowly. "Yeah, that might be him. He fixed a faucet and some fence. Quiet guy, kept to himself." Chen asked if Tom remembered when exactly the man had left. "Morning of the 14th, I think. Yeah, because I remember making a note in my log that I needed to find someone else to help with the walkway repairs." October 14th, one day before Rebecca checked in, one day before everything changed. Chen drove to Ashford and walked Tom through everything he could remember about Kevin Walsh's stay, the repairs he'd done, the conversations they'd had, the areas of the motel Walsh had accessed. Tom remembered that Walsh had asked to use the bathroom in the office a few times since his room didn't have working plumbing during the repairs. He'd been in the office. He'd seen the registration system, the keys hanging on hooks, the layout of how Tom managed the property. Walsh would have known which rooms were occupied and which were vacant. He would have known Tom's routine. He would have known that after 10 p.m., Tom was in his apartment and wouldn't hear anything happening in the guest rooms. He would have known everything he needed to know. Detective Chen obtained a warrant for Walsh's arrest. He was still in custody in Idaho on the burglary charge, which made the logistics simpler. On February 8, 2008, Walsh was extradited to Washington. And that brings us back to where we started. To the conversation room on February 11th, 2008, to Detective Chen asking one more time what happened to Rebecca Hartwell on the night of October 15th, 1996. To Kevin Walsh finally saying the words, "She wasn't supposed to fight back." Walsh explained that he'd returned to the Pinewood Motel on the evening of October 15th, intending to take items from one of the rooms. He'd been passing through the area again, had seen lights on in several rooms, had remembered the layout from his previous stay. He'd chosen room 7 because he'd watched Rebecca park her car, a nice car that suggested she might have valuables, and because the room was at the far end of the building, away from the office. He'd knocked on the door around 10:30 p.m. When Rebecca answered, he'd forced his way inside. He'd intended to restrain her, take her money and laptop, and leave. But Rebecca fought. She didn't just comply. She screamed. She grabbed the lamp and swung it at him. They struggled. The lamp fell and shattered. Walsh cut his hand on the ceramic. In his panic, wanting to stop her from alerting others, he did what he did. Afterward, he searched the room for anything valuable, but he was shaken, bleeding from the cut on his hand. He took nothing. He left through the back window, walked through the woods to the road, and left the area on foot. 3 days later, he was in Oregon, where he was cited for trespassing. He moved on, got odd jobs, committed more offenses. The Rebecca Hartwell case became one incident among many in a life defined by poor choices and criminal opportunism. He never thought he'd be caught. DNA testing in 1996 wasn't what it became later. Databases were smaller. Connections between jurisdictions were weaker. He assumed if they hadn't caught him in the first year, they never would. But technology advanced, databases expanded, and on a routine burglary arrest in Idaho, his DNA was collected and uploaded to a system that connected him to an incident committed over a decade earlier. Kevin Walsh was charged with first-degree felony homicide. The trial began in September 2008. The prosecution presented the DNA evidence, the testimony from Tom Brennan placing Walsh at the motel, the recorded statement, and the timeline showing Walsh's movements through the region in October 1996. The defense argued that the statement had been coerced, that Walsh had been exhausted and confused, that he'd said what detectives wanted to hear. But the recording showed Walsh speaking clearly, providing details only someone who had been there would know. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. On October 2nd, 2008, 12 years and 17 days after Rebecca Hartwell's passing, Kevin Walsh was found guilty. At sentencing, Rebecca's family finally had the opportunity to address Walsh directly. Linda Hartwell read a victim impact statement describing the 12 years of not knowing, of suspecting innocent people, of watching the person responsible walk free while they grieved. Sarah Hartwell spoke about how her sister's unsolved case had defined her entire adult life, how she'd channeled her grief into advocacy, how she'd fought for the very DNA database expansion that had finally identified Walsh. Walsh showed no emotion during their statements. When asked if he wanted to address the court, he declined. Judge Patricia Morrison sentenced Walsh to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As Walsh was led from the courtroom, Linda Hartwell collapsed into her husband's arms. 12 years of waiting, of hoping, of fighting was over. They had their answer. They had justice. But they would never have Rebecca back. The Rebecca Hartwell case became a turning point in how cold cases were handled in Washington state. The success of DNA technology in solving a 12-year-old case with minimal traditional evidence demonstrated the critical importance of preserving forensic samples and expanding databases. In 2009, Washington passed legislation requiring DNA collection from all individuals arrested for felonies, not just those convicted. This single change would go on to solve hundreds of cold cases in the years that followed. Detective Sarah Chen received commendations for her work on the case. She continued working cold cases and would solve 17 more before retiring in 2024. David Pierce, the IT consultant who'd been a person of interest for years, received a formal letter from the Lewis County Sheriff's Department clearing him of any suspicion. He told reporters he held no ill will toward investigators, that he understood they'd been doing their jobs. Derek Hartwell never publicly commented on Walsh's conviction. He continued living in Oregon and passed away in 2019 from a heart attack. The Hartwell family declined to attend his services. Tom Brennan, the motel manager who'd unknowingly hired Rebecca's future attacker to do repairs, struggled with feelings of responsibility for years. He attended counseling to process the trauma of being peripherally connected to such a terrible event. He eventually found peace by volunteering with victim advocacy organizations. The Pinewood Motel is gone, replaced by a gas station and convenience store, but there's a small memorial plaque in the area where Room 7 once stood, placed there by Rebecca's family. It reads, "In memory of Rebecca Ann Hartwell, 1967-1996. Gone, but never forgotten." Kevin Walsh remains in Washington State Penitentiary. He's now 62 years old. He's granted occasional conversations with journalists and documentarians in which he expresses no genuine remorse, blames his actions on substance issues and desperation, and insists he never intended things to go as far as they did. No one believes him. The case reminds us that justice delayed is not justice denied, that technology can illuminate truth even when traditional detective work reaches its limits, that families who refuse to let their loved ones be forgotten can change systems and protect future potential victims. And it reminds us that sometimes the answer was always there, preserved in a blood sample on a broken lamp, waiting for science to catch up, waiting for databases to expand, waiting for one routine arrest to create the connection that would finally bring someone to account. Rebecca Hartwell deserved better than to lose her life in a roadside motel room at the hands of a stranger. But her family ensured that her loss meant something, that her case contributed to changes that would help solve countless others. That's the legacy of the Pinewood Motel mystery. Not just one solved case, but a system improved, a process refined, and a reminder that even the coldest cases can be solved when we refuse to give up. Rebecca Ann Hartwell, 29 years old, beloved daughter, cherished sister, dedicated professional. A woman with plans and dreams and a future that was stolen from her. She deserves to be remembered not just as a victim, but as a catalyst for change, and as the reason Washington State expanded its DNA database, as the inspiration for her sister's advocacy work, as proof that families who demand answers can move mountains. Rebecca's story doesn't end here. It continues with every cold case that gets solved because of expanded DNA databases. It continues with every family that gets closure because investigators refuse to give up. It continues with you right now, learning about her case and understanding why forensic technology matters, why victim advocacy matters, why these stories matter. If you believe that every person deserves justice, that every family deserves answers, that every victim deserves to be remembered, then subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that like button. Leave a comment telling us your thoughts on how DNA technology has changed criminal investigations. Share this video so more people can hear Rebecca's story, because the more we share, the more we remember, the more we honor these victims, the harder it becomes for perpetrators to hide in the shadows. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring enough to watch until the very end. We'll see you in the next investigation, and until then, remember, justice may be delayed, but it's never truly denied when good people refuse to forget.